Thank you very much, Janine, and thank you to Jan and Stefan for inviting me. As Janine mentioned, it is definitely a work in progress, so I'm really looking forward to your comments and thoughts about it. As you'll have gathered from the title, it's a very specific year, and the project is a sort of case study of a moment in time, and I'll cover that, why that is and what's important about that as I go through. So yes, okay. Right then. So this title is taken from Gilbert Ford's letter, who wrote in 1756 that he was so chained down by my business. And of course, he was alluding to the enslaved people by which all free Jamaicans made their money, either explicitly or implicitly. Ford continued, quote, "I am ad scriptus terrae, attached to the land, for some time at least, as much as any of my slaves." A planter himself, he also clearly held powers of attorney for many other people, and included were H. and Matthew Binloss, whose affairs were causing him many problems in 1756. He advised his London correspondent, John Taylor, that Molly Waddell's demand on Henry Binloss's estate is, quote, "not worth a rile. The judgment creditors will scarce receive 5 shillings in the pound, and his widow, who brought him £4,000, is left almost a beggar. There were no bounds to his luxury and extravagance." As for Taylor's own bill on Matthew Binloss, Ford told him, quote, "It lays for waste paper in my secretaire," that's a business desk in English, "and I dare believe it will continue so, as he is shut up in his plantation, and there is no likelihood of coming to speech with him. He has for a long time been letterproof." Now, Matthew Binloss died in 1782 with a personal estate of £11,500, including 143 enslaved people. So he was not poor. But his and his father's case highlights the fact that getting money from people in Jamaica could be difficult due to the high level of indebtedness of planters and the scarcity of money and bills of exchange. So this is just by way of introduction. I now sort of want to think about very briefly where this fits in historiography, my whole project on Jamaica. So much of the historiography on Jamaica, when we're talking about free people and especially free white people, it's dominated by work such as Peckley, but also Trevor Bernard, who's now linked with us as well, who's the head of WISE, and Katie Donington's recent Bonza family is about elite merchants as well. And this is dominated. Whenever you learn about Jamaica, white people, it's planters and merchants. And even Daniel Lives's recent Children of Uncertain Fortune, which is about children of mixed heritage, is still to do with children of the elite. So that's one thing that's dominated. More recently, what's also becoming stronger in the literature, however, is that not only were these, planters and these merchants, often those that wrote about were successful, but they were also really successful entrepreneurs, quite modern businessmen. And this has been extended to ideas about adopting mechanisation and industrial sort of products and industrial techniques as well. What is very, very rarely written about, though, are the ordinary whites. And indeed ordinary free people of colour, not so often, because the sources aren't just usually there. So it's quite rare to see like articles such as this by Bernard et al. On really like just how expensive it was for poor whites to live in Jamaica, and how poor they often really were. And also Christine Walker's last year, her great book on Jamaica ladies, which looks at women. And these two things are not very well studied. And so my project is trying to feed into this and add to this literature on ordinary people. And this is what I'm trying to do with this here. So what I want to do now is just tell you a little bit about my source so you can see what I've been using. So in late November, I should say, 1756, a ship, the Europa, left Jamaica here, bound for England. It got nearly home in December, this latitude here, and it was taken by the French. 2 days later, on its way back, the Europa was retaken by the English. And when the English retook this ship, what was really unusual is that under the guns in the captain's cabin, they found a bag of letters, the bag of letters from Jamaica. Now, usually these have been thrown overboard or whatever, but also this isn't the bag, but this is what it would have looked like hanging up in some tavern, no doubt, in Kingston, in Jamaica. So in the National, I should say that these post bag of letters was then taken as evidence along with the ship and its cargo, as was normal, by the High Court of Admiralty, and it was taken into Falmouth, and then the whole process starts with the High Court of Admiralty. Now, these letters were written between September and early November from mostly white people, but merchants, planters, overseers, attorneys, the occasional artisan, ordinary sailors, and even some women. Of course, they were never delivered because they were kept as evidence. Now, in the National Archives in the UK, there are literally thousands and thousands of these collections, okay? But always, of course, mostly in French, Spanish, or Dutch, our 18th century enemies. So this collection is really unusual because the letters, of course, are in English. And so far, I have not found any other collections of letters from Jamaica for the 7 Years' War with the letters still. The prize papers are still there, but not the letters from the original letter bag. And in fact, I only found one during the American War of Independence as well. So maybe another project, one, I hope. So what's really interesting about this then is this letter bag or collection of letters is really random. As I mentioned, all these people. So there's probably other economic historians in the room. So we're used to sort of seeing, mercantile letter books or accounts that are all from one person and often the elite if they're kept as a collection. So this is quite random. But also what I've done is, even although a lot of the letters are by elite planters or elite merchants amongst the other people, I've read those letters not to find out about them, but to try and use them how they've written about other people. So, when Ford was writing, I'm really interested in the other people he's writing, for example. So this unique cachet of letters from the Europa's post bag offers a wonderful opportunity, a sort of prism through which to explore the lived experience of a wide range of ordinary people, including women and the enslaved, against the vast backdrop of transatlantic slavery. And so I've used these letters as a start point, and I transcribed everyone, all the marginalia, all the envelopes and everything. But then I also tried to find out everything else I could about 1756. So I found odd collections of mercantile correspondence and accounts that cover this year. The Board of Trade records, which is sort of like the Board of Trade looked after all colonial trade. Accounts produce, which are in the British Caribbean, were accounts that had to be forwarded for any plantation that was being run by an attorney because they were absentee plantation owners. Manumission records for freed enslaved people, state papers, trade directories. And then what I tried to do is also look for more information on the people that I found. So then I've used, if I can find mortgages or deeds or wills, but also plantation inventories and appraisals as well. So that's sort of a bit about where I'm coming from and the sources that I've used. So really exciting to find this bag of letters, and the letters are obviously very interesting themselves, but as we all have to do, we have to justify our project apart from the fact that it's just very interesting, isn't it? But 1756 is important in European history, let alone British history. A lot of the letters do come from Kingston, not all of them, they come from all around the island. But Kingston was not only Jamaica's main port in 1756, it was the leading Caribbean entrepot port for all Caribbean slavery at this time. It's also the start of the 7 Years' War. And obviously some of my European colleagues may argue with me, but the British certainly felt by the end of the 7 Years' War that they had got hegemony and control of the Atlantic world. And this certainly gave the plantation owners and the merchants, the elite in Jamaica, a certain confidence that lasted for a couple of decades until at least the abolition movement kicked in. But it's also just before a major slave revolt as well, known as Tacky's Rebellion in 1760, after which attitudes towards the enslaved really hardened and racial lines really hardened. I'm not saying it was great before, but it got worse, okay? And new laws were brought in, not only about how controlling enslaved people, but how much wealth might be left to freed people of colour and what roles and work freed people of colour might do as well. So it's this important moment in time as well to say something, say about the lived experience of ordinary people in the Caribbean within the British Empire. And the paper today, because I thought it fitted the most well with your centre, all comes from one chapter, which is called Making Money. And it asks this question: how did non-elite free people contribute to and benefit from the local, regional and Atlantic economy of Jamaica? So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to briefly give you sort of a bit of context about Jamaica's economy in 1756. And then, as Janine mentioned, it's quite a wide range here of topics. So basically, I'm going to give you, these are the sections that are in the chapter that look at different aspects of the non-elite. And I'm just going to give you some sort of prime examples of each. I'm not going to try and rattle through everything that I found. Okay, so Jamaica's economy in 1756. So even if, like the Fords and the bin losses, you were successful on paper financially, extricating money and yourself out of Jamaica was a difficulty of long standing. In the 1740s and 50s, Robert Sterling had written home every year that his departure had been delayed for 1 year or another. And when Samuel Rainford went to Jamaica in 1774, he probably did not expect to die in Jamaica some 24 years later with only wealth equal to the credit that he was originally extended when he first moved out there from Liverpool. Jamaicans were known to be litigious, but going to court did not necessarily produce the best outcome. Scotsman Robert Ewart noted in 1755 that someone could be worth 10,000 but go to jail for 500 because of the vagaries of our insolvency and bankruptcy laws. And so that's probably one of the reasons perhaps why Binloss was hiding in his plantation. Therefore, whilst many wanted to get rich quick and return to Great Britain, this was not always possible. Alan Carus noted about the Scots that all began their careers as sojourners and most wanted to return home as quickly as possible. And that was in fact true of most people that went to Jamaica. They wanted to get rich quick. But many wanted to return home as well, as quickly as possible. And those who seemed to positively enjoy living in Jamaica, such as Simon Taylor, were in the minority. So despite these problems, and as I mentioned briefly in the sort of historiography briefly, the Jamaican planters have often been called capitalists, and the plantation system itself has been likened to industrialism. According to Barry Higman, its scale of capital investment and output technology, processing function, and large labour force meant that the sugar plantation was, quote, a precursor of the modern industrial factory. And more recently, Bernard and Garrigus have argued that Jamaican sugar planters were amongst the most accomplished capitalists of their time, and that they were relentless innovators. So Jamaica, it's been argued, was essentially modern. Indeed, the mercantile capital, Kingston, was a modern city where it was argued everything was sacrificed to business, a perpetual pursuit of gain, but also of pleasures. Between the 1740s and 1770s, average returns on capital for planters, the elite, were over 10%, which is around that the average of returns for successful slave traders, for example. Those planters who owned huge swathes of land also benefited from economies of scale. For example, in 1754, William Beckford owned the most in the island, over 22,000 acres across 9 different parishes. Likewise, merchant Robert Duckinfield was also one of the most prominent merchants in Kingston, and his house is in fact featured on this map of Kingston done by Hay in 1745. And a year later than my project, he died worth nearly £20,000 in personal estate alone, so not even the land that he owned. In the year of my study, Thomas Blagrove of Hanover died worth nearly £95,000, and Alexander McFarlane of Kingston £74,500. In mid-century, Jamaica's capital resources were vast. Stock, land and industrial estate, housing and furnishings was around 7.6 millions. And of that, about 3 million is estimated to have been held in enslaved people. Of those enslaved people, around 52% worked on sugar plantations. And although by the mid-18th century, Jamaica was known for sugar production, in fact, only about 32% of individual settlements were based on sugar. But by the mid-18th century, they were large plantations and successful plantations. And so, although the number of settlements was only a third, it dominated the landscape. And this, of course, also varied by parish. Kingston had no sugar plantations, whilst Hanover had the most at 71%. Many were somewhere in between. So although sugar dominated, Jamaica was far from being monocultural. But as I mentioned, that sugar had drastically changed the landscape and large plantations dominated. But there were also many, many more smaller settlements or plantations growing things such as ginger, cotton, coffee, pimento, provisions for the island, and livestock pens. What they call them pens in Jamaica, sort of small farms. So over the 18th century, trade between Great Britain and the British West Indies grew significantly. And by mid-18th century, nearly a quarter of all Britain's imports came from Caribbean islands such as Jamaica. The annual value of produce exported from Jamaica to Britain was about 580,000, of which 510,000 was sugar, so 88%. So it also not only dominated the landscape, it dominated the money as well. Rum came a poor second at nearly 7%, followed by cotton at 2%. Pimento, molasses, mahogany, ginger, fustic, logwood, ebony constituted the remainder of exports from Jamaica. In return, Jamaica imported around £572,000 worth of commodities. And although it wasn't completely monocultural, just about everything else except foodstuffs, including some foodstuffs, was imported: clothing, medical supplies, tools for the plantations, food, butter, also salt beef and salt herrings for the enslaved, of course, and interest on loans, and of course, purchase of enslaved people as well. The remainder came mostly from North America in the form of food, candles, naval produce, horses, and another word. So, of course, the most infamous import was enslaved Africans. Jamaica alone received 1/3 of retained imports of the British slave trade. Many others were exported, especially to the Spanish. In 1756, 40 slave ship vessels arrived in Jamaica alone, disembarking 10,000 people, 1,666 enslaved people having died on voyages in that year alone on the Middle Passage. Of those that survived, about 70% were male, 45% were children, Many came from the Bight of Biafra, West Central Africa, Bight of Benin, with some others coming from the Windward and Gold Coast. And these were all pretty much a standard or representative of distribution in the British slave trade. And by 1756, the enslaved made up about 90% of the population. So in Kingston, a few men, elite men, such as Thomas Hibbert, Samuel Rainford, who I mentioned, dominated the factorage and enslaved people. And these elite successful merchants and the elite successful planters who had large fortunes or access to credit could more easily survive or even profit from the vagaries of war. By autumn 1756, when the Europa's letter bag was being filled, the French squadron was cruising the Caribbean, credit was tight, trade was constrained by convoys and closed markets, and so making money in 1756 was not easy for everyone, even with white privilege. So now what I'm going to do is turn to the sort of 5 sections and get talking really about the ordinary people. Okay. So here you can see one of the letters here. So even in periods of war, a few ambitious men found an opening by elite traders, merchants leaving the trading community. So, for example, in late 1756, the partnership of Mailer and Hall was due to expire, and they advertised that their house, store and wharf in Port Royal Street, which was right near the docks, Kingston, would be let from July the next year, as they intended to return to England, and indeed had been for some time past, quote, determined to wind up and close all their old affairs as fast as possible. One such person entering this gap was John Crow, this is one of his letters here. And he was trying to make his way as a commission merchant, handling business for people in London. Writing in October, he hoped that his total residence in Jamaica would not be longer than 2 years. So again, this trope of, I want to get out and get back. Quote, he wrote, quote, for I am tired already and would be happy to make way for younger people by that time. Yet he clearly felt he still had a lot to prove. He added, quote, you may depend my remittances will be better and better. Like so many others writing at this time, because it is the rainy season, he complained about the very hard rains and that no business could be done at the wharves. But he was not complacent. He wrote to another correspondent, quote, pray recommend all your friends to me as an agent if they'll have any prizes taken in this part of the world or any commission business. But he was still in a position where he was trying to save money. So, for example, he always he wrote that he always would cover the first £200 of any cargo himself, not insure the first £200. And he wrote really annoyed to a London ironmonger, William Freak, who had insured some items without his, quote, positive direction so to do. But at the same time, he was already well integrated in Jamaica's transatlantic credit networks. He was paid £50 sterling with a bill of exchange drawn on William Perrin, who was a leading merchant payable to another merchant in London. And he was paid another £100 by a bill drawn on Rose and Stephen Fuller. And Rose Fuller has just left Jamaica at this time to go back to England. He was an elite planter who later became an MP. And Stephen Fuller was the agent who lobbied Parliament on the island's behalf. But Crow felt that his path had not been easy, and he complained, I have struggled hard up the hill. So John Crow may have been ready to leave Jamaica and hand over to the next generation, as he was, quote, not likely to increase my family, I hope. And in fact, he was one of the few merchants that was living in Jamaica with his wife and at least one daughter in Kingston. But in fact, he died in 1763, leaving Anne widowed in Jamaica. And so like many others, his plan to get rich and leave Jamaica within 2 years did not come to fruition. So next, I want to think about ship's captains. And I mentioned very briefly in the introduction that one of the things that happens is in this period is altered markets. I didn't have time to go into that, David. If anybody wants to ask me about that, especially with regards to the slave trade, please do in the questions. So working at a distance from their principals, ships' captains had, of course, to be given some latitude, and therefore a good and trusted captain was really important. And Captain William Clutsam of the Hope of Bristol provides a good example of the difficulties of working in periods of war. And I love him because he has so many different things happen to him, and his name in sort of English, it means, you know, Clut is an idiot. So it's not actually him that's the idiot, it's everything happens to him, but he's one of my favourite people. His cargo to Jamaica consisted of, are there anyone interested in mercantilism here? The cargo had loaf sugar on it. So we have a prime example of mercantilism at work, importing loaf sugar, highly refined sugar into a sugar island for the elite, but also bacon, peas, grits, cheese, herrings, pork, butter, beef and pork, which he sold through elite merchants in Kingston. Let's say this is where I've tried to read against the grain of some of these letters. The Fords reported back to the ship's owners back in Bristol, in fact, that the crew, quote, being a parcel of drunk fellows, have all left him. His chief mate is dead, and his second mate, a worthless scoundrel. It appears that some of Clutsam's crew had signed up on a man-war, hoping to make some quick money from privateering, and actually this in other chapters comes up quite a lot. The Fords continued, quote, this has laid the captain under some difficulty, people being very hard to be got. And Clutsam was not alone in this predicament. Captain Cook, who was the captain of the Europa on which the letters were found, had to borrow money in order to hire enslaved people to load his vessel, as some of his people had left him and others had died. Now, Captain Clutsam eventually managed to get enough crew together for the journey home, but it is clear that there was some doubt as to whether the crew would actually turn up. The Fords noted that, quote, no dependence is to be put on what such fellows say. Not all of Clutsam's contacts, were so understanding. Gerard Nash, a recently arrived factor in Jamaica trying to make his way as well, was scathing about Clutsam. On the 8th of October, he wrote to John Clark of Bristol that, quote, Captain Clutsam greatly disappointed me in regard to what he promised to take on board. Nash wrote on the same day to another correspondent, John Reed, also of Bristol, that Clutsam had, quote, shut me out and would take nothing on board for me, though he promised to give me the preference. Now, Nash may not have known about Clutsam's travails, but in several letters, he used Clutsam as an excuse not to send payment. So I think actually Nash is really struggling to get payment, to get bills of exchange, and he's using Clutsam as an excuse that he can't get goods on board with which to send the bills. Of course, he could have sent the bills separately, but he didn't. So despite Nash's protestations and complaints, Clutsam was clearly a good captain. He continued to work for the Monkleys throughout the 7 Years' War, was in Jamaica again in 1760, and was still working for them in 1768 and 1773. Despite working for the Monkleys, however, for over 17 years as a trusted captain, he did not have that much to leave his family when he died. And by the time he wrote his will, in 1761, his wife Mary, to whom this letter is written, had already died, and so had one daughter. And there didn't seem to be any real estate to leave to his family. And actually, there were only some trinkets and minor bits of jewellery that he left to his family. And in fact, the daughter that had died, her clothes were in fact left to another daughter as part of the will. Okay, so the next category I'd like to think about is sort of plantation attorneys and overseers. So in Jamaican history or historiography, so I say, plantation absenteeism is quite a big debate. And it meant that there was a demand for skilled plantation attorneys and overseers. We don't really know how many there were in total, as opposed to lawyers per se, and others with powers of attorney, because many people ran more than one estate. There's no sort of general list of them. So the attorney was expected to see that directions of his employer were implemented and to ensure the profitability of the proprietor's investment. Whilst it has been argued that overall planter absenteeism in more recent historiography did not hurt the system of slavery overall in Jamaica, no doubt it was problematic for individual estates, as we'll see. So one of the attorney's tasks was to supervise the overseers. And there's a guide written by a guy called Thomas Ruffley that's published in the early 19th century, who says that, quote, an overseer should be a man of settled, sober habits, presenting a gentlemanlike appearance. Now, anybody that knows anything about the overseers in Jamaica will laugh at that. All Jamaican men were known to be heavy drinkers and not really very sober or settled. And even if a proprietor was living in Jamaica, but not on the estate, problems could still ensue. So a Colonel Lawrence was living in Kingston and had been absent from his estate before his death and had trusted the estate management to an overseer. However, when he died, this overseer was soon discharged by Lawrence's executors for misconduct. And a bookkeeper, so they call it a bookkeeper, in Jamaica, it often meant the same as perhaps an overseer, was being sent to replace him. And Charles Bernard, one of Lawrence's executors, was going to give the plantation his attention as he resided nearby. And this often happened. Nearby planters would look after their mates' plantations, sometimes for free, but obviously when he died with an expectation of getting paid first and perhaps getting some of the fees of being an executor. Another overseer that was fired was David Campbell. And another planter wrote to Rose Fuller, who I'd mentioned back in England, that he would not make 40 hogsheads of sugar this year. Moreover, he added, quote, had I not gone up, he would have killed 40 slaves. You never saw an estate so murdered in all your life. There was not a grain of corn in the house, nor a field, not a plantain, nor a morsel of any provision that a white person could put in his mouth. And it's notable that Allpress, as Rose Fuller's agent or attorney, did not appear concerned for the plight of the enslaved. Now, one of the reasons for poor overseers and artisans, or their behaviour being poor, may have been the rather poor living conditions and wages. So, for example, following his visit to Jamaica in 1756, Caleb Dickinson, a Bristol merchant and plantation owner, was able to report to another plantation owner that a small house had been built whilst he was in Jamaica for the overseer on Hodges Lacovia plantation, which consisted of, quote, a stall, a lodging room, a shade room, and it's as small and plain as it could be made. Presumably, any new overseer, however, was supposed to be grateful, as before this new build, quote, the overseer lodged over one of the curing houses in a loft, and if I mistake not, went up to it on a ladder. So the next section I have in the chapter is sort of rather roughly called those supporting slavery. And a lot of these occupations are some that we might not think straight away being related with a slave society. So the busy capitalist island of Jamaica may have been dominated by sugar, but a vast range of other work was required to support wider Jamaican society. And these included auctioneers, jail keepers, shipwrights, clerks, tutors, tutoresses, people running taverns and rum shops, insurance underwriters, and there was even a director of a spa, also named Bath, which is a famous spa town here in England, of course. So, but one person who wasn't very successful, and this is his advert here, is William Turton Greer. In May, he had advertised in the Jamaica Current newspaper as an auctioneer or vendue master, and he had rented, quote, a large and commodious store on Harbour Street, which was just one back from Port Royal Street, so right near the hustle and bustle of the port. And he sort of borrowed on the reputation of an elite merchant, Jasper Hall, by saying that his property was near it. He advertised that he would be ready to start selling for others from the 1st of June and thanked the many merchants who were encouraging him. However, clearly his auction business was not a great success, as in October, he petitioned the House of Assembly for relief. Before setting up as a Bendu master, he told the Assembly that he had settled on 20 acres of land and had, in his own words, applied himself industrially and had grown cotton and other provisions with a small enslaved labour force. Several misfortunes, which he argued to the House of Assembly were, quote, not owing to extravagance or neglect, meant that he had hardly made a sufficiency for himself or his family. And he further tried to add to his good character by stating that he had not received the weekly allowance the generality of new settlers had been granted. So, as I mentioned, 90% of the population is enslaved people by this time, and the government in Jamaica kept trying to find new ways of incentivising white people to come to the island, usually unsuccessfully. But in 1749, under a law, new arrivals in Jamaica could receive 20 acres of land, like Greer mentions, and whilst waiting to settle that land, could also receive meat, drink, washing and lodging at the taxpayers' expense in Jamaica. So that's to what he's referring. And so he argued that he needed to sell his land, his 20 acres, in order to start a new career, but had no title to it. So that's what he wanted sorting out. So without this relief, he argued, which will sink him into irretrievable ruin and misery. Now, it's noteworthy that he was trying to sell his land to pay his debts rather than his small enslaved workforce. Perhaps he intended to rent them out to provide income, as so many others did. But also, I mean, if land was worthless without enslaved people to work it, so he had to do it that way. He couldn't, in some ways, keep the land and work himself. Maybe he could, but certainly it wasn't an option people did. Okay. So last, but definitely not least, is managed to get a section together for about women. So what is not mentioned in the letters very often is the work of women. And that's partly because women often in this period wrote letters less often than men for a variety of reasons. And therefore, even than poorer men, we see only glimpses of their working lives. And women's work may have been gendered in Jamaica as elsewhere, but it was also racialised as well. So, for example, white women were less likely to be employed in tasks such as being a washerwoman or marketing, which was seen as the preserve of people of colour, and including the enslaved as well. As elsewhere in the British Empire, women's access to capital and credit was hampered by primogeniture and their femme covert status when married. But they still did make a contribution, and they were still powerful agents of slavery. So, for example, many women owned plantations, including an enslaved workforce, and many others owned large numbers of enslaved people who they rented out for an income. Sometimes they lived in towns and rented them out in a variety of different tasks. There were a few people, such as Anne Morley, whose letters this is here, who were involved in international trade and were fully integrated into the local and regional credit networks. But others rented out rooms, made and sold food, made working clothes for the enslaved and for white people. They huckstered corn, they were upholsterers. Mrs. Mary Rogers, you can see here on the left, it's highlighted. This is actually an advert for an insurance guy, but here is next to Mrs. Rogers' tavern. So she was a tavern keeper. And there's a woman of colour, Mary Cremble, who almost certainly ran a brothel, taken from her probate inventory. Perhaps more typical, however, was Anne Burley, who also may have been working as a tavern keeper in Kingston, having taken over from her husband, who died in 1755. She was the enslaver of just one boy worth £20. What work and life with the girl that J. Ripley wanted Nathan Sprigg to send him over from London, but to only give her 10 guineas? Possibly she was to be a domestic servant, a seamstress, or perhaps even implicitly a sexual partner for white males. People such as Verena Shepherd have argued that if she was to be indentured, her life might not have been that different for an enslaved woman during the period of her indenture, at least. Mary Shaw, who had been paid £42 in September 1754 for 26 weeks' hire as a nurse, may still have been working in Port Royal. The poor widow, Charity Bates, petitioned to be released from giving evidence to the House of Assembly on account of her age and infirmity. I don't know what she had to live on at all, but it appears that she was not wealthy enough to even have had her estate probated. And when you think that people who even only had £20, and this is well under the limit at which the legally an estate has to be probated, she must have been very poor indeed not to have probate done at all. And indeed, of course, as in Britain, many women were poor. Sarah Jones was a widow with 3 small children. The youngest had been born since the family had arrived in 1753, and she was pregnant with a 4th child. Her now deceased husband had set him up in business as a retailer, having brought a small cargo with him, probably trying to set up as a small-scale merchant or trader, and now his creditors were pressing her. But in turn, he had left her several bad debts which she could not collect. And she told the Assembly, quote, she was reduced to the lowest extremity. And like William Turton Greer, she added that the family had never applied for any assistance from the public funds, referring to that law of 1749. It's possible that her deceased husband was William Jones, noticed as a huckster in the probate inventories, with £68 of his personal estate of £183, about a third listed as bad debts. Elizabeth Potter was also a widow living in Kingston and left just £25. Mary Ann Trickett was a Kingston, another widow, who left only £12, including one enslaved woman who must have been, with that value, quite old and infirm herself. Mary Wallace lived in St Mary, a widow with all of her £96 estate in debts and no enslaved people. So she must have been a very small scale retailer, for example. Of course, not all women were reduced to the lowest extremity, and all free women were better off than enslaved women by far. But often we have few clues as to how poor white women made their living. Like the enslaved, the traditional archive hides them too. So using this unique collection of letters has provided me at least an insight into the work, and in other places in the book project, an insight into the lives of non-elite actors at this important juncture in Jamaican history. It certainly confirms and expands on recent work by Bernard et al. And Walker. And elsewhere in the book, I've got chapters on war and politics, on family, death and disease, on consumerism, and also a chapter on the enslaved as well. And I think what I've tried to do here, or with the work here, is to complicate this dominant narrative of Jamaica's economy, the historical of elite planters and successful merchants. And it is clear that whilst Jamaica was Britain's richest colony, and it had in fact the highest per capita income in all Britain and its colonies, wealth was not equally distributed even amongst whites. Despite this, non-elite people still did contribute to and benefited from, of course, the local, regional and transatlantic economy in many ways. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for them, in no way. Lesser merchants made money, if not as quickly as they would have liked. Ship captains got the job done, even if sometimes, especially in war, it was slower than they might have liked. Attorneys as a group may not have hurt the economy overall, but they did, no doubt, severely damage individual estates. A whole host of people that we might not have thought of originally found employment in a variety of ways that might not have been well paid as they'd hoped, but it still was employment and it still gave them opportunities. And legally and socially, of course, they were still ranked higher than free people of colour and any enslaved, however wealthy they were. And white women and some women of colour benefited from a gendered but also racialised economy. And everybody that was free in Jamaica owned enslaved people, whether they were people of colour, whether they were black, whether they were formerly enslaved. So non-elites made varied and important contributions to Jamaica's economy, but were not always so able to profit from their labours as were the elite. Many whites felt that they struggled financially, or at least presented themselves as such, despite having many advantages over free people of colour, let alone enslaved people. All of these ordinary free people benefited in some way from the slave economy, if they were in no way chained down by their businesses, as they may have thought. As I say, let's not feel sorry for them. They clearly benefited from Jamaica's slave society, but not everyone did so equally. Thank you.